Now in the last video, I talked about abstract military concepts like deep battle and blitzkrieg. I limited tactical information to a handful of examples such as Bagration and the Lvov-Sandomiersk operations. However, with this video, I want to take it one step further and talk about the army strengths throughout the Great Patriotic War. I used to be of the inclination that the Soviet Union won purely on numerical superiority, but it turns out to be a bit more complicated than that. You see, during much of 1941, the Axis held a numerical advantage on the Soviet Union. In the summer months, the Axis had a roughly 1.5 to 1 ratio in their favor. This advantage gravitated even more toward them in the autumn period, particularly due to the massive encirclements accomplished in the first phase of operations. For example, by November 1941, for every Soviet soldier on the Eastern Front, there were 2 Axis soldiers to fight them. The numerical advantage suddenly shifted to favor the Soviets in December of that year, but they wouldn't accomplish a 2-1 ratio until the autumn of 1943. By that point in time, we already had massive engagements like Moscow, the Ryazov operation, Stalingrad, and even Kursk. Even though the Soviets maintained a numerical superiority during this period, it wasn't to the point where they could use their soldiers like cannon fodder. So what happened? How did they win?
Now, for sake of objectivity, I don't want to sound biased or give the Soviets more credit than they deserve, but this impression that numerical superiority played such a impressive role on the ultimate Soviet victory, it's a bit exaggerated because of the fact that the ratios of the armies were quite similar and in a parity up until early 1944. It was only after Operation Bagration when the Soviet armies destroyed Army Group Center, pulverized Army Group North, and pushed it to the Courland pocket, and essentially destroyed Army Group South. Was when the numerical ratios actually spread and became more exaggerated to the point where when the war finished in May, the Soviets held about a 4-1 advantage, meaning that for every Axis soldier there was on the front, and this includes satellite troops like the Hungarians or Italians, for every Axis soldier on the Eastern Front, there were 4 Soviet soldiers to supplement them. So at this point, they could definitely take the casualties and use less precautious battle tactics against the Axis. But at the same time, they were running very low on manpower. Believe it or not, they were ravaged by this war in terms of an industrial capacity and in terms of, like I said, manpower. So they still didn't want to do that, and you could see that with their hesitance, especially during the Berlin offensive, the offensive where they attacked the Oder offensive, where they attacked over the river Oder near Silo Heights. You could see their reluctance as well in other areas, particularly Breslau area, where they pretty much bypassed Breslau, which became a Festung or fortress, Breslau fortress, and didn't surrender until the documents of surrender were signed in, I believe, the 7th of May. I can't remember Victory Day. That seems terrible. But yeah, we get this really big impression. I just want to make this point in the video very, sorry for the lighting, very less scripted so I can explain it in this way. The Soviets obviously had a numerical advantage in tanks, aircraft in the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, but a lot of these tanks were outdated. There were BTs, which are okay medium tanks, and T-26s, which were terrible, and they didn't really pose much of a threat against the Panzer, I think 3 and Panzer 4. But the Panzer 4, I don't think it was really that mobilized in the beginning of operation, so I'd say it was mainly the Panzer 3 and Panzer 2. But when the Germans actually did confront the small pool of modern Russian medium and heavy tanks like the KV-1s and the T-34-72s, they actually did a good heap of damage on the Germans, especially in the Battle of Uman in central western Ukraine. This was probably one of the largest tank battles in the war, even compared to Kursk. the Germans had a very difficult time countering the force of T-34s because they didn't have sufficient anti-tank weapons to dent the sloped armor of Soviet tanks. But then again, this doesn't change the fact that the Germans actually did possess that numerical advantage, and the reason the Soviets really won the war, and I think this book that I've read is fascinating about it, is that they were great at deception, really. They gave the Germans this impression that they had this outstanding numerical superiority, and sorry about that, I just had to press pause. So they gave the Germans this illusion of numerical superiority, and the way they did it is by strategically placing the reserves in the rear, where German intelligence from the Abwehr couldn't really detect them. I talked about it more in the last video about deep battle, but they did that and placed it in certain focal areas, whether it was through a defense in depth like in Kursk, or deep battle preparations like in Bagration. They did it to really overwhelm the attacker, either through attrition or just having to deal with all the flanks that were happening. In the defensive measure, in Kursk 1943, the Soviets laid out an echelon-style formation with 3 or 4 defensive belts, plus a strategic reserve in the back.
Don't forget me.
So a lot of people go like, oh, the Soviets probably almost lost, you know, the Germans hit the last belt, defensive belt, but it wasn't the case, because the Soviets had a whole nother army group right behind, just waiting to be deployed in case the Germans broke through. So honestly, at that point, Germans were kind of toast, and the Soviets anticipated this battle. So that's a perfect example. And in Bagration, Soviets also, around Vitebsk, around Mogilev, I call it Mahilo because Hearts of Iron 3 did that to me, but in Mogilev and Vitebsk, perfect example of how the Soviets could encircle the Germans by just overwhelming them with numbers and kind of tricking them that they were going to do an offensive in the south to sort of push the Romanians out of the war. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is just a quick explanation. If you're interested in this, please subscribe to my channel, like and share this video with all your friends, because this is the kind of topic that I really love focusing on, and can't wait to see you guys next time.